Well, hello.
Hello, Marty.
Hello, Richard. This is Martin Seligman. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's my great pleasure today to be with my friend Richard Layard, who will introduce himself.
Well, I'm Richard Layard. I'm from the London School of Economics. I'm actually an economist, but I've been having tutorials from Marty in psychology for the last 10 years, either face-to-face or by reading his wonderful writings. And I'm now very much on to trying to get happiness re-established as the central goal for our society. And that's why I've been involved in launching something called Action for Happiness. Okay, so you suggested that I should say something about Action for Happiness, which is this movement which we've just launched. And the idea is a very, very simple one, and of course not a new one, which is that the best society is the one where there's the most happiness and in particular the least misery. It's an idea going back to the 18th century, but it was difficult to implement until we had the new science of happiness, which Marty and others have been developing over the last 30 years. And I think that now it's really timely to take advantage of that. And I think why a movement is important is partly because we have the new science. It's partly because we have increasingly, with the retreat of religion, the retreat, if you like, in some countries of socialism, we've got a moral vacuum where people have not really got a clear sense of what would be a meaningful purpose for their lives. And we're saying, go back to the 18th century, go back to the idea that the way you should lead your life is to try and create the most happiness in the world around you and the least misery. And you can do that with the aid of positive psychology and all the tools which social science has begun to deliver to us, which tell us how to help others to be happy and also how to help yourself to be happy. So if you're saying, how does this movement work? It's of course centered around the internet, and there in the website, people who come there will be asked to make a pledge that they will lead their lives so as to try and create more happiness and less misery. It's quite a pledge to make. We don't want people to do it lightly, but we then want to help them to do it, to execute the pledge, by providing them with keys to personal happiness and actions that they can take, which will help the happiness.
What is the website, Richard?
The website is called actionforhappiness.org, and it's based heavily on positive psychology, but it also has another element in it, Marty, which I'm keen that we develop in parallel with positive psychology, which is, if you like, more of a move to altruistic living, not just because it benefits the altruist, and there's a lot of evidence which you produce that that's so, and that people who care more about others are happier than people who care more about themselves, and that you can experimentally induce caring behavior, and people are found to become happier and so on. But not just because of that, but even more because of the benefit to the other people. So I think that what we're after is something where basically your value system is developed the way that Aristotle wanted, as a habit, that you form the habit of thinking, what should I do? What job should I take? How should I behave in the situation? I think the habit is, well, think about the other people and think about their happiness.
This takes advantage of something that I would call Richard's genius. I wanted to relate, I think, at least the second best piece of advice I ever had, which came from Richard a few years ago, which in some ways embodies what he's up to in Action for Happiness. I know in Blogging Heads we're supposed to say adversarial things, so I'll do that in just a bit. But first let me say something completely non-adversarial. Richard and I were in Glasgow together about 5 years ago. And if I could ever characterize Richard's position in the world, in the medieval monastery, the abbot was the person who stood between the secular and the sacred. And I think Richard has combined that in his life, the world of politics, the secular or the profane, and then the London School of Economics and being a world-class economist, the sacred. And Richard stands right between that. Well, given that background, we're both speaking at a meeting in Glasgow, and we're walking through Glasgow together afterwards. And Richard says to me, Marty, I've been reading your stuff on positive education, and I'd like to take positive psychology to the schools of the UK. And so I said something like, oh, yes, Richard, we've been doing a lot of pilot work, and I think we're just ready to do a small pilot study in Liverpool. And Richard looked at me and said, Marty, you just don't get it, do you? You and most academics think that the relationship between public policy and science is such that when science accretes up and up and up to a point that it becomes, the evidence is so compelling that those of us in politics adopt it. Well, I've never known a case like that. What happens in the real world of politics and its intersection of public policy and science is that evidence accretes to a point that there's enough, that it's sufficient, and the political will is present. And I'm telling you, Marty, your evidence is sufficient for positive education. The political will is present in the UK, and I'm going to take positive education to the schools of the UK. And I think Richard's done the same thing again. I think he's saying that the evidence has mounted up not perfectly, but sufficiently that living one's life around building well-being, around building happiness is sufficient, and the political will is present. So I wanted to ask you, Richard, is the political will present, and what kind of reception and resistance are you running into politically and publicly?
Well, we had quite a lot of support. As you know, at the political level, this actually started with the OECD, the Rich Man's Club in Paris, Rich Countries Club, where the statisticians took the lead to say, surely we should be measuring the well-being of the population. There had been, of course, previous movements for measuring various dimensions of the quality of life, but they said no, following very much on the work of psychologists, go right to the heart of the person and find out how they actually experience life, their subjective well-being. So that's where it started. David Cameron picked it up, not after the crisis, but when he became leader of the Conservative Party, he made a speech saying that the aim of a government should be not economic growth, but the general national well-being. He called it General National Well-being, GNW. But economic growth was downgraded to a means to an end, and not an end in itself, in his original speech. And again, when he is now, since he became Prime Minister, officially decided that the statistics which our Office of National Statistics have been planning to collect anyway, that these should be part of the official statistics for the country, not just an interesting survey, but they will be there in the annual abstract of statistics alongside the gross national product. So I think that is a very important move. I think the most interesting bit of it is that they decided to have a big enough sample, a huge sample, so that there would be meaningful statistics for every municipality. So you can just imagine the councillors sitting in their council meeting and saying, my God, the people living in that bit of our town are just so miserable. Why is it? And then they'll try and link up that characteristic of misery to other things which the survey will also show are affecting those particular groups of people. I think this will produce a radical rethink of how policy is made, and the same thing, of course, at the central government. Policy appraisal is done now in terms of money. I'm quite sure in due course it will be done in terms of well-being.
Coming from an economist, it's really revolutionary, Richard. I think it was you who said if we don't measure the right thing, we can't do the right thing.
Right.
But how are your economist friends? Are you seen as a traitor to economics for saying let's measure well-being and happiness as opposed to sterling?
I wish they were as excited as that. I think most of them haven't quite dawned on them yet. But of course there are groups of economists in every country, in particular in the leading US schools at Harvard and places like this, Princeton, where this is engaging some of the brightest young minds in economics. And we're now having some of the same results at London School of Economics. But I think prophets without honour in their own country, it takes a while to convert your profession. But what is interesting is that the government economists, the head of the British government, a wonderful chap called Sir Gus O'Donnell, who is an economist, he is passionate about this, and he has meetings with all the heads of all the government departments and says, we want you to spell out how you would be running your department differently if well-being becomes the objective. So this is quite transformational. And then we've also had, of course, particular changes in some areas, like much greater emphasis on mental health within our national healthcare system. It's still going slowly, but that's a really important change, because there was this extraordinary view that what you can see and touch is more important than what people actually experience inside, because you can't see it. We're pushing that back.
In the course of this endeavor, I wrote a memo to the Cameron government, which I think I titled, "It's Not the Economy, Stupid." And what I basically argued was that in a stagnant economy, that I believe that people look to their well-being for their politics and political opinion. And to the extent a government like the Cameron government or Obama's government is stuck in basically a stagnant economy, then the criterion by which we judge how government is doing is how much well-being do they create. And given that, changing the criteria by which we judge government from increasing wealth or increasing military conquest to increasing the well-being of the citizens of the U.S. and the U.K. strikes me as just a revolutionary change in our concept of government. And I was wondering when you were talking about practical things that different departments in the U.K. would do if they started to take increasing well-being seriously. What are some of the practical and surprising things that a department might do?
Well, as I say, in the health, the big issue is mental health, and particularly, of course, the 1 in 6 people who are suffering from depression or anxiety disorders, not the extreme cases of psychosis, but the 1 in 6, of whom typically in any country in the world, not more than a quarter of those people are under any form of treatment. I mean, this is scandalous. Even people in serious depressive episodes, under 50% are in any form of treatment in all our countries. It is really scandalous, and it shows the sort of deep materialism of our society, that we take a little scratch more seriously than we take the heart crying itself out. That's one. Second area is education and schools. You already mentioned it, but I think that we are going to see, we already saw to some extent under the previous government, a change of priorities towards social and emotional learning, which was introduced as a standard program throughout schools. But it was not manualized in the way that produces well predictable results. And in fact, one of the evaluations of this program was rather gloomy, and became conclusion because it had seriously tried to measure outcomes before and after people had gone through the program with a controlled trial. It came to the conclusion the program had no effect. So I think we have to recognize that if we really want these policies to work well, they have got to be seriously evidence-based, and we have got to have proper trials and show it. That's what we're trying to do with your resiliency program in the now 60 schools in Britain which are using it. But we're going to try and bring the experience of other programs that we have found around the world to deal with other dimensions of personality and behaviour. We're hoping to bring them together to form a much more extensive program which can be used for over a 4-year period of secondary education. I think that's important. Going on, one very interesting area where this new well-being thinking has had an effect is in pension policy.
Pension policy?
Yes, because the line always was very, very strongly the rate at which you save should depend on consumer preferences. So let's take no view about it. And the result, of course, was that people undersaved, and there was the prospect of massive poverty in old age arising.
Yes.
We had a pension commission, and they drew on the evidence of sometimes called behavioural economics, sometimes happiness psychology, but the evidence from this science that people don't have well-defined preferences, consumers, between saving and spending. And what they actually do depends very much on the way the options are framed. And if you say, we will include you in a savings program, let you opt out, you get something like 80% staying in. Mm-hmm. If you put it the other way around, then you have to opt in. We find that only 20% are opting in. So this law now says you have to save unless you opt out. And that's a very interesting application of aiming at the happiness of the population and seeing that there's a big elderly population coming who are not saving up, and we just say, well, that's how we're going to try and deal with that.
Right, right.
But if you want, I'll just give you one more final example. I think that the response to the shocking behaviour of the banks is the following. The banks got away with it by saying, don't you regulate us because that will reduce the rate of long-term economic growth. Happiness research shows that what matters to people is not the long-term rate of economic growth, but the stability of the economy. And we are now seeing worldwide restrictions put on banks in order to preserve the stability of the economy. So these are gains that are being made as a result of our way of thinking.
Right. So Richard and I have such broad areas of agreement, it would probably be good fun for us and for the audience now to talk about the things we disagree about. But let me just say what the broad areas of agreement are. We agree that action for happiness is its time has come. We agree that government should measure well-being, and that measures of well-being should supplement economic measures to judge criteria of public policy. And we agree that in healthcare, in pensions, in education, that policy should be directed to increasing well-being. So that is very broad areas of agreement, but for fun, let's talk about where we disagree and what the future brings. So Richard, let me bring up one area of disagreement that you and I can have fun with. So it's the question of what should we measure. Now, I think Richard has been the most articulate advocate of the notion that there is a final common path to human choice, and that's happiness and life satisfaction. And therefore, if we measure for public policy increases and decreases in happiness and life satisfaction, that we will have better than a first approximation to how well government is doing. So let me disagree with that for a moment. First, I think that's one ingredient, but I have the doubt that life satisfaction and happiness are a sturdy enough timber to build an edifice by which we judge public policy. And let me say what I mean by that. I think in my new book, Flourish, I argue that there are 5 elements of well-being that need measuring, the first one of which is positive emotion. The acronym for this is PERMA, and the P stands for positive emotion. And indeed, happiness, life satisfaction, contentment are all good measures of that. But in addition, I want to contend that there's an E, an R, an M, and an A. And they're different from and don't feed into a final common pathway of well-being. So E is engagement, the extent to which you're completely absorbed in what you're doing. R is relationships. M is meaning and purpose in life. And A is achievement. So what I believe that measuring happiness is a good first start. But we need also to measure all of PERMA. We need to do it both subjectively, how engaged are you right now, how good are your relationships, but we also need to do it objectively. And so, for example, in Consumer Reports, we ask people how much they like their automobiles, how satisfied are you with the gas mileage you get. But we also really want to know what is the gas mileage you're getting, and we want to combine objective and subjective indicators. So, Richard, let's debate for a bit now whether or not we need more than just subjective measures of happiness and satisfaction, or whether or not we can rest on that.
Well, if we just go back to the very big picture, what are the goods for humans? I suppose in a sense you're listing five. Some people list others as well. Marty would put in freedom and other things as being necessary conditions for human flourishing. But you can ask a question of each of these things. So if we took, say, accomplishment or relationships, or freedom or health, other things that people would include, physical health, you can ask, why do they matter? And you will enter into a further discussion. I mean, why do relationships matter? Well, you feel terrible if you are isolated or if you're in conflict with other people. Why does physical health matter? You feel terrible if you're sick. Freedom, terrible if you're oppressed. Accomplishment, well, you like to feel some sense of competence. You feel better if you feel some sense of competence. But if you ask the question, why does it matter if people feel good or feel bad? There's no further discussion. At least I think that for most people, it is so obvious that matters. That is, in some sense, and your colleague Dan Gilbert has argued this head more professionally than me, in some sense, this is the ultimate reality for people, how they feel. And the subjective, what happens inside us, is the most real thing, which has the character of being the overarching thing that matters for us. I find that very persuasive. Now, of course, I have what you have referred to in some of your writings as a sort of modest approach. I'm looking for an overarching thing, so I find it convenient to be able to use that argument.
Right. It's certainly embedded.
But let me just go on a second. I mean, why do I want to have a monist?
Yes. Why a monism?
A monistic thing, because if you have lots of different things, all of which you say are important, in the end you often have to make choices between them. And so you've got to have some overarching thing with respect to which you can make the choices. And the overarching thing, in my view, is what will determine the importance which you attach to all these other things, which I totally agree with you are extremely important, and external reality that is quite objectively measurable is very important. But it's important because of the way it impacts on inner experience. And the way I see this measurement thing going forward, therefore, is we should measure. I totally agree with you, and this is what we actually propose to the British government. We should measure all of these things. The things that you want to measure is one of the things I want to measure. But when it comes to actually making policy choices, how to spend public money, or indeed ultimately how we should balance the demands on our own lives, we would be interested in weighting the different things according to the strength of their influence on this final, ultimate thing, happiness. And I still think that your PERMA, you will be under pressure in the end to produce a single number for PERMA, and then you'll have to say, well, how much do we weight these different things? And you'll have to do it by doing some statistical analysis which shows how much each of them contribute to something like overall life satisfaction or something of that sort. That's my guess as to how your program might well find itself being pushed.
Right. Well, let's just think about an airplane for a moment. So in an airplane or automobile, we have a dashboard of indicators. So we have airspeed, how much fuel is left, direction, wind speed, temperature, elevation, and the like. And there's no one number that tells us how the airplane is doing. Rather, it depends on our mission, which number we attend to. Sometimes it's getting there as quickly as we can. Other times it's conserving fuel. I think the human mission, our choices, the choices of free people, is more like an airplane. And I'm skeptical that there's one number that tells me, well, how is Richard doing? Or how am I doing? Or how is the UK doing? I think it depends on the mission. And so, as you know, I've been a psychotherapist most of my life. And if we think about PERMA, there are some people who value positive emotion. There are other people who value meaning. There are other people who value accomplishment a great deal for its own sake. So for me, as a psychotherapist, the question is asking, well, given that you've got this panel of gauges on your dashboard, which ones do you want to maximize? Do you want to know about maximizing meaning in life? Do you want the techniques of increasing good relationships? Do you want to know having more pleasure in life? So I think what I'm doubting is that given the individual differences in how we weight the elements of PERMA, and given the huge differences within a nation of how different people and different groups would weight feeling positive emotion, having good relationships, having achievement, it becomes important to measure these separately rather than just having one number.
Well, of course, I completely agree with you that people derive satisfaction from different things. That is actually the strongest single argument for having a free society. We will not have a group of people enjoying their lives unless each of them feels that they are able to choose that, make their own choices as to how they live to achieve what satisfaction they can. So that is completely crucial. But if we're now talking about measuring by governments, it's a bit different. We're not saying, this is a measurement that we're going to give to each individual, and we're giving you the dashboard so that you can decide how to lead your life. I mean, to some extent, people already have their own dashboards, and they are leading their lives. We're doing these measurements for the sake of governments, in order to enable them to try and create the conditions in which people can make those choices which lead to the most satisfying and enjoyable lives. And there, you are bound to operate to some extent in terms of averages. So that's why it is of interest to know what is the average importance which individuals attach to different things. And I'm including now objective things. How important is income? How important is physical health? How important is having work? How important is having work you like? And so on. So it's very, very important that we know the relative importance of these things from the point of view of government, because in the end government has got a single pot of money, and it's spending that money on different ways in which it can help people enjoy their lives and get the kind of satisfaction which we all want. And
Let me try.
It's a single pot, and it's irresponsible not to try and spend the money in the ways where you get the best bang for the buck. And therefore, the bang has got to be measured also in one metric that can be compared with the bucks.
Right. So let me try one of the paradoxes of, for me, of life satisfaction and of happiness as a final common path. So there's this large literature on extroverts versus introverts, and it suggests to me that measurement of happiness and life satisfaction is undemocratic. That is, it overcounts the extroverts and it undercounts the introverts. So there's reason to think if government builds a park or if someone goes to a movie, that extroverts are more responsive as far as increases in happiness and life satisfaction go, and introverts are stony soil and don't respond much emotionally, not nearly as much. So I wonder if we introduce a policy and we measure how much happiness is increased by it, if we systematically undercount the introverts and systematically overcount the extroverts.
Well, now I want to bring in another modification. What I've been presenting so far, in a way, is the vision of Jeremy Bentham, isn't it, where you just add up the happiness of all people.
Right.
I think that was a mistake, and I've argued that in the book that I wrote on happiness. And I've always thought that you should pay
time for endorsement of books. Richard has written 2 editions of a magnificent book called Happiness, and for those of you who don't know the history of the controversy and its implication for politics, there is no better read than the new edition of Richard's book, Happiness.
Well, thank you very much. And Marty has written 2 books. You only referred to one of them, but the first book, Authentic Happiness, is really absolutely key component, to my mind, of your overall contribution. And the Flourish takes it forward, adds some of your later thinking, the history of how the positive psychology movement has evolved and the impact, including on the US Army and so on. But I would strongly recommend everybody to read both of those books. But going back to what you were saying about my book. In my book, I take a simple case. You take a 2-person case. I mean, which is better? To have 2 people being equally happy at, let's say, 5 units of happiness, or having one person at 6, one at 4.5. Obviously, the total has gone up in the second case, but somebody has gone down. And I'm saying we should pay real attention to avoiding people falling into low levels of happiness, and more attention to that than pushing people on up or already up. So that, I think, relates to your point about extroversion and introversion. It may not do it completely directly, but typically your introverted person is probably less happy, and that's why we should be paying particular attention to the way in which our educational system, our social system, the way in which we handle decisions about leisure activities and so on, caters to people who are likely to be toward the bottom end of the distribution. So I think that's the way we should do it. And of course, as our knowledge grows, we will have different models of the weighting of different factors in determining the happiness of different groups.
Right. In my way of thinking, introverts are very good at meaning and engagement, and therefore, if we just measure life satisfaction, what we overcount is the lability of extroverts' emotional response, and we undercount what introverts are really good at, which is engagement and meaning. Let me just try another paradox, and that's the question of why do we have children? So it's puzzling, the literature that's emerged from Gilbert and Kahneman and other people, which say that if you look at the life satisfaction of childless people, it's higher than the life satisfaction of people with children. Now, that to me is a bold indicator that free people choose to do things, have children, on more of a basis than just happiness and life satisfaction. For me, the choice of children, having children, I have 7 of them, is not based on getting up in the middle of the night and changing their diaper, the area under the curve of happiness, but rather relationships, meaning, and engagement. So, Richard, on a life satisfaction basis, why do we have children?
Well, some people do and some people don't. so, I mean, here's a very important point that I can always make as an economist. I mean, why do some people read books and some people not? Maybe they're equally happy. But that's because the people who like books read them, and the people who don't like books don't read them. So the finding that people who have children are equally happy with the people who don't have children doesn't mean that the people who have children are not happier as a result of having the children. That's a very important point. But let me go on to a different aspect of this. I feel that there is a whole unstudied area about children, unless you know of studies. Children, of course, don't cease to be children when they leave the home, but all the surveys that we are talking about are ones where you're asking the person, do you have children living with you at home? And for most of the time of the child's life, while the parent is still alive, the child not at home. And that whole area needs to be studied, because people may be getting a huge amount of happiness from the children when they're not at home, which helps to explain how to have a picture of their life as a whole. People have children, in many cases, realistically knowing, with quite a hassle, but because it will make their life as a whole.
I wanted to say something about subjective measures and what I think is no longer a science fiction possibility about enormous improvement in both the measurement of life satisfaction and the measurement of PERMA generally. So right now, if the Cameron administration or Gallup wants to know what is the happiness in Manchester or the happiness in China, or how good are relationships in Omaha, what they have to do is telephone or door-to-door surveys in which they ask people for their opinion about how satisfied they are or how good are their relationships. And notoriously, one of the softest things about psychology and one of the edges that economists have on psychologists is the objectivity of sterling versus your opinion about life satisfaction. Well, it has occurred to a bunch of us, I'm sitting here with Johannes Eichstädt now, one of the leaders in this, that there may be much more objective ways and much less expensive ways of measuring the well-being of the world in space and in real time without all the negative aspects of doing fallible surveys. And that is, given the existence of email and Twitter and blogs, and given that PERMA, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, all have a lexicon, there are words that people use to describe them, if one could crawl through de-identified email, Twitter, blogs in real time, one could get much finer estimates by looking at how often they deploy PERMA words and anti-PERMA words, words like love and hate, words like happy and miserable, and quantify public policy, its effects across the world by measuring the lexicon of PERMA.
Well, I think that's a very interesting idea, and I mean, we know all these findings about the frequency of positive and negative words and their correlation with the durability of a marriage and the success of an enterprise and so on. So I'm sure there's a future in that. I thought you were going to raise actually another thing which I think is worth mentioning, since we're having this debate about measurement, which is the use of physiological measures.
Right.
Actually, what persuaded me to write my book was the discovery that your colleague Richard Davidson had discovered these areas in the brain where positive and negative affect are experienced. And I think that is a very promising area. And I think without something like that, we're not going to be able to settle some of these arguments about, can we take it seriously when we're told that Scandinavian countries are the happiest countries in the world. We want to be sure that the Scandinavians are using words the same way that other people are.
Right.
We can only be sure of that by going inside their brains and seeing what's going on there. There are, of course, other cheaper ways of doing this, which are things to do with cortisol, immune responses, and so on. But there are many, many biomarkers with which we can either validate or devalidate.
Indeed, there is a growing field called positive neuroscience, of which I play a small part, in which young investigators around the world are asking the question of what is the relationship of biological markers, of hormonal states, of cortical states to reports of happiness and to situations that we know make us happy and unhappy. So I think in general measurement is going to be improved both by combining objective and subjective measures as well as broadening what we measure from just life satisfaction to the entire range of PERMA. I think we have a very rich measurement future in front of us.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, well, I would say there are two big sort of challenges facing us. One is we know a lot more about individuals than we know about societies, and yet if you ask what can we do, a lot of the things that we can do obviously have got to relate to societies rather than to individuals, because individuals operating in dysfunctional societies are not likely to experience PERMA or happiness.
In that regard, we might just close on a question that both you and I always have thrown at us, and that is those of us who advocate looking at happiness and well-being and building public policy around it are merely advocating a nanny state. And I wonder, Richard, if you could conclude with some of your thoughts on freedom in the nanny state and perhaps.
Well, I think it's a very simple one, isn't it? Because we do know so strikingly from these cross-national comparisons, if you just look at the scatter of reported happiness in different countries, that the communist countries were the least happy states whose happiness has ever been recorded. Less happy, really completely separated off at a lower level of happiness from all the third world countries.
Right.
They were. And then, of course, the first world countries are the happiest. So I think we know straight away that political and I would say associated freedoms, the rule of law, freedom of enterprise, and so on, these things are absolutely essential to enable people to get happiness in the way that they make their choices in life. So I think that is so clear that however much the bureaucrat sees that something might be good for happiness if you could achieve it, they have to think about what is the actual impact of the means by which they might try and bring that about. And my view is that there is probably far too much regulation now because the bureaucrats have not included the subjective well-being effects of their regulations, which drive people nuts. So I think that we're in for a very interesting change in priorities. This is not a policy. Going to well-being as the objective is not something which is necessarily going to favour left or right. It's going to produce something very different of both. And I think it's a very exciting future. I actually do believe very strongly and passionately I wouldn't have done any of this if I didn't believe that through use of our knowledge about this and getting people to take this on board internally, as our movement is trying to do, they really do want to produce more happiness in the world. And with the tools that Marty and others are providing, I think we really can have a happier world.
And I'd close with a parallel thought. For me, what defines positive psychology is choice. What free, unoppressed people choose to engage in. And PERMA, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement are my best guesses about what people choose. And the one thing we know about choice, if you take any circumstance and you give it to people, impose it on them, versus having them choose it, it is completely clear that choice adds an enormous amount to well-being, and that having it imposed on you subtracts from well-being. So I thoroughly endorse that. That's one reason why this movement of ours, we want to be a grassroots movement where individuals and groups are determining the direction in which it goes. But we hope that people who've been watching this might visit our website at actionforhappiness.org and see if they agree with where they're trying to go. Hope they will. Well, Richard, let me sign off by thanking you for doing the bold initiative of Action for Happiness, but more than that, for telling the world that the time has come to judge government not just by how much wealth and military conquest it creates, but how much well-being it produces for its citizens. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.